Luke Wells never wanted to be anyone's problem. He was the kind of man who valued his independence above all else, a trait forged during his years in the military and solidified after the accident that took his leg. When the doctors told him he'd have to adjust his expectations, he simply nodded, strapped on his prosthetic, and got back to work. He wasn't the type to dwell on things, nor was he the kind to complain. Life handed him a challenge, and he met it head-on, the same way he had always done. That was the only way he knew how to survive. After leaving the service, Luke didn't want to be part of a corporate machine. He didn't want to sit at a desk, working under someone who didn't understand how to handle real pressure. Instead, he bought a run-down old hardware store on the edge of a growing neighborhood, renovated it from the ground up, and turned it into one of the most reliable supply shops in town. It wasn't a massive franchise or some gleaming megastore with endless aisles of overpriced nonsense. It was a no-nonsense, practical shop for people who actually built things, for people who fixed their own houses, repaired their cars, or worked in the trades. His customers respected that. They didn't come for the decor, the discounts, or the fake smiles. They came because they knew Luke stocked what they needed, priced it fairly, and never gave them the runaround. For the past 5 years, his business had grown steadily. Contractors, plumbers, and electricians stopped by regularly. Locals who didn't trust the big box stores knew they could find the right tools here without dealing with the hassle of an impersonal checkout line. Luke liked that. He liked the quiet efficiency of it all, the sense of control. He had employees who knew their jobs, regular customers who respected him, and a daily routine that kept everything moving. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his, and that was all that mattered. Then Karen Winslow moved into the neighborhood. The first time she stepped into his store, Luke knew exactly what kind of person she was. She had that air of superiority, the way some people walked into a place as if they already owned it. She wasn't looking at the shelves to find something she needed. She was assessing the space, judging the layout, deciding where things should be if she were in charge. Her perfume was overpowering, her jewelry too large, her sunglasses perched on top of her head, as if she had just returned from some high-powered business meeting instead of a casual stroll around the neighborhood. But what struck Luke the most was the way she looked at him, not at his face, but at his prosthetic. He caught the flicker of distaste in her expression, the way her eyes darted down just for a moment before snapping back up. It wasn't pity. Pity he could tolerate. This was something else, something colder, something rooted in the belief that people like him should not be in positions of authority. "Is the manager here?" she asked, her tone clipped and professional. Luke, standing behind the counter, wiped his hands on a rag and raised an eyebrow. "You're talking to him." Karen blinked, as if she needed a moment to process that. "Oh," she said, voice dripping with false politeness. "I see. I was hoping to speak with the owner." "That's me," Luke replied evenly. She hesitated, then forced a tight-lipped smile. "Oh, well, I suppose that simplifies things." She glanced around, wrinkling her nose slightly. "I just moved into the neighborhood, and I'm on the community board. We like to keep things up to a certain standard around here, and I couldn't help but notice that your store looks a bit, well, it could use some updating." Luke stared at her for a moment, debating whether to entertain this conversation. "It's a hardware store," he said finally. "Not a boutique." "Right," she said, not missing a beat. "But we're trying to maintain a certain aesthetic in the area. First impressions are important, don't you think?" Luke folded his arms. "People come here to buy tools, not to admire the paint on the walls." Karen let out a small, forced laugh. "Well, I just wanted to introduce myself and see if you'd be open to a little modernization. Maybe something more in line with the rest of the community. You know, better lighting, a more welcoming storefront, that kind of thing. I'm sure I could get you some recommendations." "I think I'll pass," Luke said. "But thanks for stopping by." Her expression tightened for just a second before she composed herself. "Of course. Just something to think about. She paused, looking at him again, this time more deliberately. I also noticed that you're working here yourself. Do you have enough staff to handle everything? I imagine it must be difficult for you given your situation. Luke's jaw clenched. He had dealt with people like her before. The ones who spoke in careful, condescending tones, masking their judgment behind fake concern. The ones who saw a prosthetic and immediately assumed weakness. I managed just fine, he said. Karen tilted her head, as if she wasn't quite convinced. Well, if you ever need assistance, I know a few people who specialize in accommodating businesses like yours. Just a thought. Luke exhaled slowly through his nose, gripping the rag in his hands a little tighter. I appreciate the offer, but like I said, I'm good. Karen gave him one last lingering look, then smiled. All right then. I'll see you around, Mr. Wells. She left without buying anything. Luke didn't think much of it at the time. Annoying as she was, he'd dealt with worse. But as the weeks passed, he started noticing small things. A building inspector stopping by unexpectedly, asking about zoning regulations he had already handled years ago. A fire marshal doing a routine check even though he'd just been inspected 6 months prior. An increase in anonymous complaints about noise, despite the fact that his shop closed at the same time every night. It wasn't until one of his regulars, an older contractor named Mike, dropped by and muttered, "That new lady from the board's been asking around about you," that Luke realized this wasn't just a coincidence. Karen Winslow had set her sights on him. She wasn't just some bored neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was organized. She had connections. And worst of all, she was convinced she was in the right. Luke had spent years fighting battles that actually mattered. He wasn't about to roll over for a woman who thought she could push him out of his own store just because she didn't like the way he ran things. But he underestimated one thing. Karen wasn't interested in a fair fight. She was playing a different game altogether, and she was just getting started. Luke wasn't the type to get paranoid over minor inconveniences. He had dealt with real problems before, situations where a single misstep could mean the difference between life and death. But something about the way things were starting to unfold made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. At first, it was just small disruptions. The unexpected inspections were annoying but not catastrophic until one of them actually resulted in a temporary shutdown. A health inspector came in, acting on an anonymous complaint about unsafe working conditions. The claim was ridiculous. Luke's shop was as clean and well-maintained as a hardware store could reasonably be. But the inspector cited a technicality, something about improper ventilation near the chemical storage area. It didn't matter that nothing had changed since his last approved inspection. The order was clear: shut down for 48 hours until the issue was resolved. Luke fixed the supposed problem within a few hours, but the closure alone cost him 2 days' worth of sales. More importantly, it sent a message. Someone was trying to make things difficult for him. Someone who knew how to work the system. And then, as if on cue, Karen returned. She strolled in the day after he reopened, wearing an expression that was equal parts pleasant and smug. "Oh good. You're back in business," she said, scanning the aisles like a queen inspecting her kingdom. "I heard there were some compliance issues." That must have been frustrating. Luke tightened his grip on the counter, forcing himself to stay calm. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Karen smiled sympathetically, though the glint in her eyes was anything but kind. "That's good to hear. You know, these things happen. Sometimes all it takes is one little oversight, and suddenly you're drowning in paperwork." She sighed dramatically. "This is exactly why I think businesses like yours could benefit from guidance. Someone to help navigate all the tricky regulations. Someone with experience dealing with the city." Luke knew exactly what she was doing. She was offering him a way out, a chance to avoid whatever headaches she had planned next. But taking her guidance would mean giving her control, and that was never going to happen. "I managed just fine," he said, voice steady. Karen let out a little chuckle, shaking her head as if he were a stubborn child refusing to wear a coat in the cold. Well, if you change your mind, let me know. I'd hate for this to become a pattern. She left without buying anything. Again. Luke watched her go, his gut tightening. This wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. This was personal. She wanted him gone. And then, things escalated. A week later, Luke was at the front counter, ringing up a contractor's order, when he noticed Karen lingering near the paint section. She wasn't alone this time. She had brought 2 other women, both of whom seemed to be nodding along as she whispered to them, gesturing vaguely at the shelves. Luke had seen her do this before, whispering in people's ears, planting ideas, poisoning wells. He ignored her and focused on his customer. The last thing he needed was to cause a scene. But then, just as the transaction was finished, he heard Karen's voice rise slightly. "Excuse me, I need some assistance over here." Luke sighed and walked over, bracing himself for whatever nonsense she was about to spew. Karen turned to him with a saccharine smile. "I was just explaining to my friends here how important it is for a business to be truly inclusive. We love supporting local shops, but it's also important that they reflect the values of the community." Luke stared at her, waiting for the punchline. One of the women with her, an older lady in a pastel blazer, tilted her head. "I have to admit, I never noticed before, but do you have accommodations for people with disabilities?" Luke blinked. "I have an automatic door and a wheelchair-accessible checkout counter." Karen clicked her tongue, shaking her head. "That's a start, but what about staff accommodations? Emergency protocols? Shouldn't businesses like this have someone on hand to assist customers who might need extra help?" Luke crossed his arms. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Karen widened her eyes in mock surprise. "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything. I just think it would be reassuring to know that every business owner here is physically capable of ensuring customer safety. I mean, what if something happened and you weren't able to react in time?" Ah, there it was. Luke exhaled slowly through his nose. "Are you asking if my prosthetic affects my ability to run my own store?" Karen gasped, placing a hand on her chest, as if she had been gravely misunderstood. "Oh no, I would never question your ability. I just think it's something that should be discussed. After all, we all have to be accountable to the people we serve." Luke had to physically stop himself from laughing. She was setting something up. This wasn't just another jab, she was laying the groundwork for something bigger. But before he could respond, Karen suddenly reached out too fast for him to react, gripping the bottom edge of his pant leg and yanking it upward, exposing the top of his prosthetic. Luke jerked back instinctively, his pulse spiking. Karen let out a tiny, dramatic gasp. "Oh, I didn't mean I was just..." Her 2 friends exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard. Luke inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed. "You just what?" Karen's expression flickered just for a second before she recovered. I was trying to understand how you manage. In case there are emergency situations." "By doing my job," Luke said flatly. "Like I do every day." Karen quickly smiled again, but this time there was a nervous edge to it. She knew she had crossed a line. She also knew that Luke wasn't going to do anything about it, not in front of customers. Not in a way that would make him look like the aggressor. She didn't need to. She had already gotten what she wanted. The moment she left, one of Luke's regulars, Mike, the contractor, walked over, shaking his head. "You need to watch your back, man. That woman's looking for a way to screw you over." Luke wiped a hand down his face. He knew. He had known from the start. And yet, he still wasn't prepared for what came next. The very next morning, a letter arrived. An official-looking document from a local business review board. It was a formal complaint against him. It claimed that his store was insufficiently equipped to handle customers with accessibility concerns and that the owner's physical condition may present a safety liability in emergency situations. Luke stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. It was signed by Karen Winslow. And suddenly he understood. She wasn't just trying to annoy him. She wasn't just trying to make him uncomfortable. She was trying to strip him of his right to run his own business. Luke stared at the letter in his hands, the words blurring slightly as a slow, simmering anger built in his chest. He had expected Karen to keep pushing, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just an inconvenience or an attempt to irritate him. This was a direct, strategic move to strip him of his business, his livelihood, and his independence under the guise of community concerns. The wording of the complaint was careful, calculated, written in the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak designed to sound reasonable on the surface but loaded with implications that could turn into something far more dangerous. It stated that multiple concerned residents had raised issues about his store's ability to accommodate individuals with disabilities, and while it acknowledged that Luke had made efforts to maintain accessibility features, it questioned whether the owner himself was fit to handle emergency situations. The phrasing was insidious. It never outright said he was incapable, but it planted the idea, leaving it open for interpretation, making it easy for a regulatory board to decide that further review was necessary. And once that review process started, there was no telling how far they could take it. Luke didn't throw the letter away. He didn't crumple it up in frustration or slam his fist against the counter like some overacted display of anger. No, he just stood there, reading the words over and over, methodically processing what needed to happen next. Karen was playing a long game, and if he was going to survive this, he needed to do more than just react. He needed to get ahead of her. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. The next morning, he met with Ryan Douglas, a no-nonsense attorney who had handled small business cases for years. Ryan was the kind of guy who never sugarcoated things, which was exactly why Luke trusted him. He skimmed the letter, lips pressing into a thin line before setting it down and folding his hands on the table between them. "This is bad," Ryan said bluntly. "Not because it has any legal merit, but because it's the kind of thing that could spiral if the wrong people get involved." Luke exhaled slowly. "I figured as much. What's the best move?" "First, we respond immediately," Ryan said. "We don't let them sit on this and turn it into something bigger. We draft a statement outlining your compliance with all regulations and attach documentation proving that your business meets every single requirement for accessibility. Then, we request an immediate dismissal of the complaint on the grounds that it's unfounded and discriminatory." Luke nodded. "That's straightforward enough." Ryan hesitated. "That's the first step. But here's the real problem. Complaints like this don't happen in a vacuum. Someone like Karen doesn't just file one report and hope for the best. She's going to keep pushing. If she's smart, she's already lined up other angles of attack. My guess? This is just the beginning." And Ryan was right. A week after they submitted the response, Luke started noticing a change in customer behavior. Some of his regulars were still coming in like nothing had happened, but others, people he had known for years, seemed hesitant, as if they were suddenly unsure whether they should be shopping at his store at all. One afternoon, as he was restocking a shelf, he overheard two men near the counter, speaking in hushed tones. "I heard they might shut this place down," one of them said. "Some kind of safety issue." "Yeah? I dunno, man. I've been coming here for years. Never had a problem." "Maybe, but if the city gets involved, you don't want to be caught up in that mess." Luke didn't confront them. He didn't need to. The damage was already being done. That night he did something he hadn't done in years. He sat down with a notebook and made a list. A strategic plan. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for Karen to dictate how this played out. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. First, he reached out to the local business council, setting up a meeting to discuss the sudden influx of complaints against his store. He laid everything out: his spotless compliance record, the targeted nature of the reports, the fact that all of this started only after Karen Winslow moved into the neighborhood. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was making sure they knew he wasn't going to roll over. Next, he installed security cameras inside and outside the store. Not just to monitor for theft, but to document everything. He wanted footage of who came in, who looked around suspiciously, who lingered a little too long without buying anything. If Karen was sending people to snoop around, he was going to catch them. And then, almost as if on cue, Karen escalated again. It happened on a Friday evening. The store was closing soon, and Luke was finishing up some paperwork in the back when he heard raised voices at the front. He stepped out to see one of his employees, Jacob, looking flustered while Karen stood on the other side of the counter, waving a printed document in the air. "I'm simply trying to understand why your business refuses to comply with the community safety standards," Karen said, her voice carrying through the store. Jacob, to his credit, looked like he was about 5 seconds away from telling her off. But Luke stepped in before that could happen. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Karen turned to him with a practiced look of concern. "I certainly hope not, but I just received word that your business was flagged for potential non-compliance. I came by to see how you're handling it." Luke stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and plucked the paper from her hand. He scanned it quickly. It was a notice, not from any official authority, but from a so-called community safety committee, that, as far as he could tell, didn't actually exist outside of whatever nonsense Karen was trying to pull. He let out a slow breath. "You made this up," he said flatly. Karen gasped, placing a hand over her chest. "Excuse me? That is a serious accusation." Luke handed the paper back to her. "Your little committee has no jurisdiction here. You don't get to decide what's compliant and what isn't." Karen's eyes flickered, just for a second, with something dangerous. "Oh, Luke," she said, her tone almost pitying. "You really don't understand how these things work, do you? Perception matters. And right now, a lot of people are starting to perceive you as a problem." Luke clenched his jaw. He could feel Jacob watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. "I'm not going anywhere," Luke said simply. "And neither is my business." Karen smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "We'll see." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the store in silence. Jacob exhaled. "Boss, she's not going to stop, is she?" Luke shook his head. "No, she's not." And he had the sinking feeling that this was far from the worst of what she had planned. Luke had always believed in preparation. That was drilled into him during his time in the military. Control what you can, anticipate what you can't, and never walk into a situation blind. He had spent the last few weeks adjusting his strategy, responding to Karen's attacks with calculated countermeasures, and ensuring his business stayed intact, despite the relentless pressure. But as much as he had planned, there were always variables he couldn't predict. And one of those variables arrived in the form of a city inspector, standing at his front door with an official clipboard and an expression that told Luke he wasn't here for casual conversation. "Mr. Wells?" The man adjusted his glasses, glancing at the papers in his hands before looking back up. "I'm here on behalf of the Business Compliance Division. We received a request for an extended review of your property due to multiple accessibility concerns. I'd like to conduct a full inspection of the premises." Luke's grip on the counter tightened, though he kept his face neutral. This was different from the previous checks. This wasn't just another low-level nuisance. This was a direct attack from someone who had the authority to make real trouble for him. He could already guess who had filed the request. "Of course," Luke said, forcing himself to stay composed. "Let me get my paperwork, and we'll go through everything." As the inspector followed him inside, Luke could feel the tension thickening in the air. He had already gone through every regulation, every requirement, ensuring his store met the city's standards. But he knew how these things worked. If someone wanted to find a problem badly enough, they'd find it even if it didn't exist. The inspection took over an hour. The inspector moved through the aisles methodically, checking shelf heights, aisle widths, emergency exits, and everything in between. Luke kept his expression blank, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just about his store. This was about setting a precedent, about pushing him toward a breaking point. Karen wanted him to get frustrated, to lash out, to give her an excuse to escalate things even further. When the inspector finally finished, he took a deep breath and flipped through his notes. Everything looks compliant, he admitted. But there is one issue. Luke narrowed his eyes. And that is? The inspector hesitated. Your counter height. Luke blinked. My what? The main checkout counter is a few inches higher than the recommended standard for HOA compliance, the inspector explained. It's a minor issue, but under new policy updates, businesses are expected to correct such discrepancies to ensure full accessibility. Luke exhaled slowly. So let me get this straight. Everything else in this store is fine. But because my counter is slightly higher than the preferred height, I'm at risk of non-compliance? The inspector shifted slightly. Look, I understand this might seem frustrating, but the complaint we received specifically mentioned issues with accessibility, and we have to address all concerns raised in an official review. It's not a major violation, but it does require correction within 30 days. Luke clenched his jaw, barely holding back his anger. This wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate. Karen had found some obscure technicality and used it as a foothold to make his life harder. It didn't matter that it was minor. What mattered was that now there was a documented infraction on record, to something she could point to as evidence that his store wasn't up to standard. After the inspector left, Luke stood in silence, staring at the paperwork outlining his required corrections. He could fix the counter height in an afternoon. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that Karen had gotten an official mark against his business, and she wasn't going to stop there. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Ryan, his lawyer. He answered immediately. I just got word about the inspection, Ryan said without preamble. I assume you already know who was behind it. Luke's grip on the phone tightened. Yeah. This isn't just about getting you shut down, Ryan continued. She's building a case against you, step by step. She's trying to make it look like you're unfit to run your business. If she can get enough marks on your record, she can argue that you're a liability to public safety. If the city starts believing that narrative, they could pull your business license entirely. Luke's stomach tightened. And what's our move? For now, you fix the counter and stay ahead of the next attack, Ryan said. But we need to be more proactive. If Karen is setting up a legal battle, we need to start gathering evidence on our end. That means documentation, witnesses, anything that proves a pattern of harassment. Luke exhaled slowly. He hated this. He hated playing defense, hated waiting for the next hit to land. But Ryan was right. Karen wasn't going to stop, and if he didn't start fighting back on a legal level, she might actually succeed in what she was trying to do. Over the next few days, Luke made the necessary corrections to his store. He took photos, got updated approval from the city, and ensured everything was in perfect compliance. But he didn't stop there. He started documenting everything, every unusual visitor, every interaction with Karen, every strange delay in shipments that seemed to conveniently align with her latest move. And then, something happened that he didn't expect. Late one evening, long after closing, Luke was in the back office going over paperwork when he heard the sound of footsteps outside. He glanced at the security feed and saw a figure moving near the side entrance, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. His first instinct was to confront them, but he forced himself to stay calm. Instead, he reached for his phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, the person was gone. But they had left something behind: a damaged security camera, its wires cut clean through. Luke felt a slow, cold realization settle over him. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. Someone was trying to intimidate him. The next morning, as he was reviewing the footage, one of his employees knocked on the office door. Jacob, a younger guy who had been working with him for years, looked uneasy. "Boss, I think you should see this," he said, holding out his phone. Luke took it, frowning as he played the video. It was a recording from earlier that morning, taken outside the store. A car had pulled up to the curb, and a woman had stepped out Karen. She stood there for a few minutes, talking to someone just out of frame. Then she glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching, before getting back into her car and driving off. Luke handed the phone back. His pulse was steady, but there was a quiet fury building inside him. "She's getting bold," Jacob muttered. "She's not even trying to hide it anymore." "No," Luke said, his voice low. "She's not." He knew what this meant. Karen was escalating. She had started with bureaucratic attacks, moved on to public perception, and now she was testing how far she could push intimidation tactics before he pushed back. But what she didn't realize was that Luke had spent years dealing with people who thought they could control situations through power and fear. And if she wanted to play that game, she was about to find out that he wasn't the type to back down. She had made a mistake. She had shown her hand too soon, and now it was his turn to move. Luke had dealt with all kinds of threats in his life. He had stood in the middle of war zones where a single wrong step could mean the difference between life and death. He had faced men who didn't hesitate to put a bullet in someone over a few misplaced words. And yet, there was something uniquely infuriating about dealing with a person like Karen Winslow. She wasn't a hardened enemy, wasn't some dangerous adversary in the traditional sense. But the way she operated underhanded, calculated, always using the system as her weapon made her even more insidious than someone who would just take a swing at him. People like her didn't fight fair. They didn't come at you head on. They chipped away at your life piece by piece, knowing that if they applied pressure long enough, eventually something would crack. But Luke wasn't going to crack. The night after the security camera was destroyed, he barely slept. He kept replaying the footage of Karen standing outside his store, the way she had spoken to someone just out of frame, the way she had lingered just long enough to let him know she wasn't done yet. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a message. She wanted him to know that she was watching, that she had people willing to act on her behalf, that she could escalate this whenever she wanted. The next morning, Luke made his move. He went straight to Ryan's office, laying everything out: the inspections, the fake complaints, the vandalized camera, and now Karen's not-so-subtle presence outside his business. Ryan listened without interrupting, his face unreadable as he jotted down notes. When Luke finished, Ryan leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad. "All right," he said. "Here's where we stand. She hasn't done anything explicitly illegal yet. But we have enough to establish a pattern of harassment. If she keeps pushing, we can file a formal restraining order. The problem is, she knows exactly how far she can go without crossing that line. She's smart." Luke exhaled sharply. "She's a snake." Ryan nodded. "That too." Luke leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "What do we do?" Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he flipped through his notes before finally meeting Luke's gaze. "We need to go on offense." Luke frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning we stop waiting for her next move and start putting pressure on her. She's playing this like a slow siege, trying to grind you down with constant harassment. We need to make it so that keeping this fight going is more trouble for her than it's worth." Luke considered that. "How?" Ryan smirked slightly. "By making sure she's got problems of her own to deal with." Over the next few days, they put a plan into motion. First, they filed an official harassment report, compiling everything Karen had done so far: the bogus inspections, the attempts to interfere with his business operations, the sudden appearance of concerned citizens filing anonymous complaints. They made sure it landed on the desks of people who would take it seriously. Then, they started looking into Karen's background, specifically her involvement in community affairs. It didn't take long to find irregularities. Karen had been on the neighborhood board for 2 years, but in that time, multiple local businesses had been hit with sudden zoning issues or regulatory disputes. Most of them had sold their properties at a loss, often to developers who had coincidentally donated to certain board members' community improvement initiatives. It wasn't hard to see the pattern. Luke wasn't the first target, but he was going to be the last. The moment Ryan compiled enough evidence to raise suspicion, they leaked it to the local business council, the same people Karen had been pretending to represent. The response was immediate. Within days, Karen was suddenly the one under scrutiny. The same bureaucratic machine she had weaponized against Luke was now turning its attention to her. At first, she acted as if nothing was happening. She kept up her usual routine, showing up at public meetings, sending out her usual emails filled with thinly veiled complaints about problematic businesses. But then, the pressure started to mount. Questions were being asked. The city was looking into past property deals, scrutinizing who had benefited from the businesses that had been forced to shut down. And that was when Karen made her biggest mistake. One afternoon, Luke was in the back office when he heard raised voices near the front of the store. He stepped out to find Karen standing there, red-faced, eyes blazing, pointing a manicured finger at Jacob, who was standing behind the counter with his arms crossed. "I demand to speak to the owner." Karen snapped, her voice shrill. Jacob didn't flinch. "And I demand a raise, but we can't all get what we want." Karen turned sharply as Luke approached. The moment she saw him, she let out a breath, as if barely containing herself. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. "Running to the city, spreading lies about me?" Luke arched an eyebrow. "If they're lies, why are you so upset?" Karen's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I have spent years building this community. I have connections. You really think you can turn people against me?" "I don't have to," Luke said. "You're doing a fine job of that yourself." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment Luke thought she might actually scream. Instead, she stepped forward, lowering her voice. "This isn't over." Luke didn't move. "It is for you." She stared at him for a long moment, eyes flickering with something unreadable: anger, desperation, maybe even fear. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out. Jacob let out a low whistle. "She's losing it." Luke watched the door swing shut behind her, his jaw tight. "No," he muttered. "She's realizing she's losing." And that made her dangerous. That night, Luke stayed late at the store, going through the latest paperwork Ryan had sent over. He had just finished locking up when he heard something outside, a soft sound, just on the edge of hearing. Footsteps. He moved toward the security monitors, flipping through the camera feeds. Then he saw it, a figure near the back entrance, barely visible in the dim light. Luke reached for his phone to call the police, but before he could dial, the motion-activated lights in the alleyway flicked on. And there, standing in the harsh glow, was a man in a security uniform. Except Luke hadn't hired any security. The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the lights. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Luke's fingers tightened around his phone. This wasn't some random act of vandalism. This wasn't just another scare tactic. Karen was out of options, and that meant she was about to do something reckless. Luke didn't sleep that night. He stayed in his office, watching the security feeds on loop, replaying every moment of the last few weeks in his head. Karen had been pushing and pushing, testing how far she could go before he broke. She thought she had control, that she could manipulate the system and twist things to her advantage, but now the balance had shifted. She was no longer the one pulling the strings. She was running out of options, and desperate people made mistakes. The man in the fake security uniform had been one of them. She wasn't just harassing him anymore. She was sending people to trespass on his property, trying to scare him into submission. That wasn't just a nuisance, it was something he could use. The next morning, he went straight to the police station with the footage, and for the first time since this whole mess started, they actually seemed to take it seriously. The officer he spoke to reviewed the video, his expression shifting from neutral skepticism to something more focused. The fake security badge, the way the man had carefully avoided looking at the cameras until he thought he was out of frame. The fact that he had left the moment the lights turned on this wasn't some random loiterer. This was targeted. You're saying you think this guy was sent by someone specific? The officer asked, and Luke didn't hesitate. I don't think. I know. The officer nodded slowly. All right, let me see what I can do. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was movement. It was one more thing Karen couldn't control. And then, as if she could sense the walls closing in, she made her biggest mistake yet. She came to the store in the middle of the afternoon, walking in like she owned the place, her face tight, her eyes wild with barely contained fury. She didn't wait for an opening. She didn't try to disguise her hostility behind fake politeness. She went straight for the kill. You think you can just do whatever you want? She spat, slamming her hands on the counter. You think you can turn people against me, ruin my reputation, and get away with it? Luke barely reacted, keeping his expression calm as she ranted. I know what you've been doing, she hissed. Straying to the city, digging through my past, feeding them lies. She was unraveling right in front of him. People like you don't belong here, she seethed, her voice shaking with rage. You think you can just play the victim and expect everyone to step aside for you? There it was. The mask had finally slipped. Luke tilted his head slightly. People like me? Karen let out a bitter laugh. You know exactly what I mean. You think just because you've got that, she gestured toward his prosthetic with barely concealed disgust, that you can just ignore the rules, that people should just let you do whatever you want because they feel sorry for you? Luke didn't move. He let her keep talking. You're not fit to run this store, she continued, her voice rising. You're a liability, a danger. You should have taken my help when I offered it. You should have stepped down quietly. But now you've made an enemy out of the wrong person. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time since this started, Luke saw something in her eyes that wasn't just arrogance or cruelty. It was fear. She knew she had lost. You finished? Luke asked, his tone flat. She glared at him, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to regain her composure. And then Ryan stepped through the door. He wasn't supposed to be there. Luke hadn't called him, hadn't asked him to come, but somehow he had known this was about to happen. He walked straight up to the counter, setting a thick folder down in front of Karen. You should read this, he said calmly. Karen scoffed, snatching it up. Oh, what now? Another pathetic attempt at a legal threat? But as she flipped through the pages, the color drained from her face. Her hands trembled as she read. The documents were copies of zoning applications, fraudulent reports tied to businesses that had been forced to close under suspicious circumstances, the emails that linked her to local developers who had profited from those closures. A paper trail leading straight to her. Ryan crossed his arms. The city council received an anonymous tip this morning. They're launching an official investigation into your activities. And from what I hear, a few of your old business partners are more than willing to talk if it means avoiding scrutiny themselves. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Luke leaned forward slightly. You were so focused on getting rid of me, you didn't realize you left a trail. Karen shook her head, her breathing uneven. This isn't real. You made this up. Ryan shrugged. Call the city yourself. I'm sure they'll be happy to confirm. She flipped through the papers again, her eyes darting across the pages like she was searching for a way out, for a loophole, for something that would undo all of this. But there was nothing. For the first time, she had lost control. She took a step back, then another, clutching the folder to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked at Luke, and for the first time there was no smugness in her gaze. Just fear. She turned without another word and walked out. The moment the door closed behind her, Ryan let out a low whistle. Damn, he muttered. That was satisfying. Luke exhaled, running a hand down his face. It's not over. Ryan frowned. She's done, Luke. She just doesn't know it yet. Luke wasn't so sure. Karen might have lost this battle, but people like her didn't just disappear quietly. Still, for the first time in weeks, the air in the store felt lighter. The pressure that had been sitting on his chest, the constant waiting for the next attack, had finally lifted. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now the consequences were coming for her. And for the first time, Luke wasn't the one who had to fight anymore. Luke knew better than to assume a fight was over just because the enemy had retreated. People like Karen didn't just disappear quietly. They didn't accept defeat, didn't take their losses and move on. They looked for loopholes, for ways to turn things back in their favor, for any crack in the foundation that could still be exploited. But this time there weren't any cracks left. She had overplayed her hand, burned too many bridges, left too many trails for the right people to follow. Now, all Luke had to do was let the consequences take their course. In the days following Karen's breakdown in his store, the fallout was immediate. The local business association issued a formal statement announcing that they were reviewing multiple complaints against her conduct, and within 48 hours, she was removed from the neighborhood board entirely. That alone would have been enough to send a clear message, but it didn't stop there. The developers who had once been happy to work with her started distancing themselves, refusing to return her calls, but suddenly uninterested in any future projects she might have had in the works. The city council, now under public pressure, reopened past zoning disputes where her name had appeared, and while no criminal charges were filed yet, the mere fact that an investigation was underway was enough to make her radioactive. And then the rumors started. At first they were small, whispers from former acquaintances, old business partners who had conveniently forgotten how closely they had worked with her, people who had once praised her for keeping the neighborhood, in order now muttering about how they had always suspected she was overstepping. People who had feared her influence now saw her as a liability, someone to be cut loose before she dragged them down with her. The same people who had helped her file bogus complaints, who had backed her vendettas and nodded along as she targeted one business after another, were suddenly nowhere to be found. Karen had spent years making herself into an untouchable force in the community, but now she was just a woman with no allies, no support, and no way to spin the story in her favor. And Luke? He didn't have to lift a finger. She had built this disaster all on her own. The last time he saw her, it wasn't in a courtroom, and it wasn't in some dramatic final confrontation. It was at a gas station on the edge of town, just after sunset, when he stopped to fill up his truck. He had just finished when he glanced across the lot and saw her standing beside her car, staring blankly at the pump, as if she had forgotten why she was there. She looked different. Not just tired, not just angry, but hollow. Her usual expensive-looking clothes were wrinkled, her hair wasn't perfectly styled, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked small. She must have felt him watching because she turned her head slightly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no fire in her gaze, no lingering defiance. Just a flash of something unreadable before she looked away, got into her car, and drove off without another glance. Luke didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt done. Back at the store, life returned to normal faster than he expected. The wave of concern from customers faded as quickly as it had come, and within a week it was as if Karen had never been a part of the equation at all. The same people who had hesitated to step through his doors when rumors had been spreading now came in without a second thought, chatting about weekend projects, asking for tool recommendations, treating him like they always had. The inspections stopped. The complaints disappeared. And for the first time in months, he didn't wake up every morning expecting another fight waiting for him. Ryan stopped by a few days later, standing in the middle of the store with a coffee in one hand and a satisfied look on his face. "You know," he said, glancing around, "I half expected some kind of last-ditch effort from her. One final act of desperation." Luke shrugged. "She ran out of moves," Ryan smirked. "And yet, somehow, I still don't think she learned anything." Luke didn't either. Karen was the kind of person who would always believe she had been wronged, who would never accept responsibility for her own downfall. Maybe she would start over somewhere else, find a new place to try and exert her control, spin some new narrative about how she had been unfairly targeted. Or maybe this was the end of the road for her, the moment where she realized that no amount of manipulation could undo the damage she had done to herself. Either way, it wasn't his problem anymore. That night, as he locked up the store, Luke took a long breath of the cool evening air and let it settle in his lungs. The battle was over, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he didn't feel like he had to keep looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next attack. Karen Winslow had tried to break him, but in the end she had only destroyed herself.